Hello, friend. Welcome back to History Hush. Tonight, I want to ask you something before we start. Have you ever stood next to a washing machine on spin cycle and thought, that's loud? Now imagine 400 of them running at once, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, in a room with no earplugs and no such thing as a lunch break longer than 30 minutes. That was just a Tuesday for about a third of the working women in New England by the 1880s. We'll get there. First, thank you. Genuinely. Whoever asked for a mill town tonight instead of another farmhouse, I appreciate you branching us out a little. If you're new here, all I ask is that you like the video, but only if it actually helped you get sleepy, and only if you feel like it. No pressure. Subscribing is free, and it means I get to keep doing this a while longer. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. I read every one, even the ones posted at 4 in the morning, especially those, honestly. All right, get comfortable. Turn the lights down if you haven't already. Let's go somewhere quieter than it sounds like it should be. You are standing on a wide brick street in Lowell, Massachusetts, sometime in the middle of the 1880s. It is not yet 5 in the morning, and the sky over the Merrimack River has only just begun to lose its full darkness, going the color of weak tea along the eastern edge. You should know, before we go any further, that Lowell was not an ordinary town. It had been built on purpose, decades earlier, by a group of Boston investors who wanted a place where water power could turn cotton into cloth on a scale nobody in America had tried before. By the 1880s, the mills along this river employed thousands of people, and the city itself had grown up almost entirely around the rhythm of those mills. Historians sometimes describe early Lowell in the 1820s and 1830s as a town of young farm girls from Yankee families working a few years before marriage. That picture is accurate for an earlier generation, but by the decade you are visiting now, the workforce looked different. Irish families had been arriving since the famine years of the 1840s, and by the 1880s, they were joined by French Canadians who came south from Quebec looking for wages that a small farm could no longer provide, along with smaller numbers of English, Scottish, and Portuguese workers. Whole families worked in the same mills now, not just unmarried daughters passing through. The mill you are about to enter is one of many along the canal system that laces through the city. Channels of moving water dug generations earlier to carry the river's power to wheel after wheel, turning shaft after shaft, driving the looms and spinning frames inside brick buildings 5 and 6 stories tall. You will notice, walking closer, that the street is already filling with people, even at this hour. Most of them are walking with a particular kind of quiet that comes from having done this exact walk hundreds of times before. Nobody is rushing. Exactly. But nobody is wandering either. You are here tonight to spend a day with a young woman the mill records and boarding house ledgers of this era would call, if we had her actual diary, someone very much like Bridget. That is not a name pulled from nowhere. Irish immigrant women make up a documented share of the Lowell mill workforce in these years, and Bridget was among the most common names given to girls born to Irish Catholic families in this period. So we will use it here, understanding that she is a composite drawn from the patterns historians have pieced together from payroll records, boarding house rules, church registers, and the handful of letters and diaries that survived. Bridget is 19. She was born in Massachusetts, though her parents were not. Her mother and father crossed from County Cork sometime before she was born, in the years when the potato blight had made staying home no longer something a family could reasonably choose. Bridget has never seen Ireland. She has only heard about it in her mother's stories, and in the particular way her father goes quiet sometimes on Sunday afternoons. The bell that wakes Bridget is not really a bell inside her room. It is the mill bell itself, ringing out across the whole city from the tower of the corporation she works for, a sound loud enough to reach every boarding house within a half mile. In a town like this one, nobody needs their own clock. Not really. The mill owns the time here, in a very literal sense. The first bell rings at 4:30, telling everyone it is time to rise. A second bell will ring closer to the actual start of work, and a worker who arrives after the gates close for the day is often docked pay, or in some mills, locked out entirely until the next break. Bridget shares her room with 3 other boarding house girls, one of them her own younger cousin, newly arrived from a smaller town north of here, where the family still has some connection to farming. The room is small, the ceiling low enough that the tallest of the 4 girls can nearly touch it, and the furniture is simple. 2 beds, shared 2 to a bed, a washstand, a single small mirror none of them fully trust for a proper look at themselves before 6 in the morning. The boarding house itself is owned by the Mill Corporation and run day to day by a woman the girls call Mrs. Doyle, a widow herself, who keeps a strict house. No male visitors past the front parlor. Lights out at 10, a curfew that Mrs. Doyle enforces with a patience that seems to run out only when it is tested more than once in the same week. Bridget dresses in the dark, mostly by feel, because striking a match this early feels like an extravagance the other girls resent when they are trying to steal 10 more minutes of sleep. She has one work dress, plain and dark, chosen specifically because the color hides cotton lint and machine grease. She has a second dress, slightly better, kept folded at the bottom of her trunk for Sunday Mass. Between the two, this dress and that dress, is most of what Bridget owns in the way of clothing, along with a shawl her mother made, a pair of boots resold twice already this year, and a small wooden box where she keeps the letters her mother writes her from the house across town, since her parents live separately from the boarding house, close enough to visit on a Sunday, but not close enough to walk home each night after a 10-hour shift. Breakfast is quick. Bread, sometimes with a little butter if the week has gone well. Tea strong enough that Mrs. Doyle's boarders joke it could stand a spoon upright in the cup. There is no time for anything more elaborate, and no real appetite for it either, not at this hour, not with the second bell already audible in the distance. The walk to the mill takes Bridget and her cousin past 2 other boarding houses, a small grocery not yet open, and a church whose bell will ring its own separate schedule later in the morning, for those with time to attend the service before their shift, which in practice means almost nobody who works the main floor. The streets fill more as they walk, other girls and women joining from side streets. along with men heading toward the same gates for work in different departments: the machine shops, the yard crews, the overseer's offices. By the time Bridget reaches the mill's iron gate, there are hundreds of people moving through it in the same 10 minutes. A river of dark coats and shawls flowing into a building that will not let most of them back outside again until midday. Inside, the noise begins before you are even fully through the door, and it does not really stop until the day ends. Bridget works in the weaving room, a long space filled with rows of power looms, each one driven by belts running up to a shaft near the ceiling, which is itself turned by the water wheels below. The sound is not something you can describe easily to someone who has not stood in a room like it. It is not one loud noise. It is hundreds of them, layered on top of each other, a constant mechanical clatter that fills the air so completely that ordinary conversation becomes impossible within a few feet of the nearest loom. Workers in weaving rooms across New England developed something historians and former mill workers have both described afterward as a kind of lip reading, a shared visual shorthand that let them communicate short messages across a loom, all without needing to be heard at all. Bridget can read her cousin's mouth from 10 feet away well enough to know she is asking what time it is, or whether the overseer has come through yet this morning. Bridget tends 4 looms at once, more than most weavers managed a generation earlier, since improvements to the machinery had made it possible for one worker to oversee more frames than before. She walks the row constantly, watching for a thread that has broken, a shuttle that has run out of thread and needs replacing, cloth that is coming out uneven and needs the loom stopped and adjusted. The work is paid by the piece, not by the hour, which means a broken thread costs her money directly, in cloth not produced while she fixes it. And this fact sits somewhere in the back of her mind through every minute of the shift, a low, steady pressure that never fully goes away, even on a good day. The room is hot for most of the year and kept deliberately humid, since damp air keeps cotton thread from snapping as often, a fact the corporation understood clearly enough that they installed pipes specifically to keep moisture in the air, whatever the discomfort to the people working underneath it. Lint drifts through the air constantly, fine cotton fiber that settles on hair, on clothing, on the inside of the throat if you breathe carelessly, and the workers in these rooms develop, over years, a persistent cough that mill doctors and later public health researchers would come to associate with the conditions, though at the time it was simply understood as something that happened to weavers, an accepted cost of the work, rather than something anyone expected to be fixed. There is real danger here too, and it would be dishonest to describe this room without mentioning it plainly. Loose hair caught in a moving belt or shaft was a documented and recurring cause of serious injury in mills of this era, which is part of why women working the floor typically kept their hair pinned back tightly under a simple cap or tied cloth, no loose strands left to catch on anything moving. Fingers were lost to machinery with some regularity, an injury common enough that it barely interrupted the working day around it. The injured worker helped out of the room while the looms nearby kept running without pause. Bridget has seen it happen twice in her 3 years on this floor, both times to women she knew by name, and both times the room returned to its ordinary noise within minutes, because a mill running at full capacity did not stop for anything short of a fire. At 12:30, the bell sounds again, and for 30 minutes, the great room goes quiet enough that you can hear your own footsteps for the first time all morning. Bridget and her cousin walk back to the boarding house for the midday meal, a walk repeated by hundreds of other workers doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. A temporary flood of people moving between mill and home twice a day, timed by a bell that belongs to a private company rather than to a church or a town government. Mrs. Doyle serves something simple and filling, usually a stew or boiled meat with potatoes and bread, food chosen more for cost and heartiness than variety, since feeding 24 boarders 3 times a day on a modest allowance from the mill corporation does not leave much room for extravagance. The half hour passes faster than it should. By 1 o'clock, Bridget is back at her 4 looms, and the afternoon stretches out in front of her in a way that feels, by her own account in letters she might have written home, considerably longer than the morning did, though the clock would insist otherwise. The light through the tall mill windows shifts slowly across the floor as the hours pass, the only real marker of time's movement in a room where every other detail, the noise, the heat, the rhythm of the machines, stays essentially constant from 1 hour to the next. Around 4 in the afternoon, word passes quietly down the row that the overseer is walking the floor, checking cloth quality, checking attendance, checking for anything that might justify a docked wage. Bridget's cousin, still new enough to the work that her hands are not yet steady with the shuttle, tenses visibly at the news, and Bridget catches her eye and gives the smallest possible shake of her head, a gesture meaning something close to, keep your head down, and it will pass, which after a few minutes, it does. The final bell of the working day rings at 6:30, and the sudden quiet that follows, when the last loom finally stops turning, is something Bridget has told her mother she still notices every single evening, even after 3 years. A kind of ringing hush in her own ears that takes a few minutes to fade. Workers file back out through the same iron gate they entered that morning, into evening light that in summer is still bright and warm, and in winter has usually gone fully dark by the time the shift ends, meaning Bridget walks home under lamplight for half the year. Evenings belong, in theory, to the workers themselves, though there is not a great deal of them left after a 12-hour day that includes the walk there and back. Some boarding houses in Lowell's earlier decades were known for informal lending libraries and evening lecture series organized by the young women themselves, a detail historians have documented with real evidence from that period, though by the 1880s, with longer hours and a workforce carrying more family responsibility than the earlier generation of young single women had, most boarders had less energy left for anything beyond mending clothes, writing letters, or simply resting before the bell rings again at 4:30 the next morning. Bridget spends part of this particular evening writing to her mother, who lives close enough to visit, but far enough that daily contact is not practical given the hours both women keep. She tells her mother small things, that her cousin is settling in slowly, that the overseer walked the floor today and found nothing worth reporting, that she has been putting aside a little money each week, a few cents here and there from her piece rate earnings, toward something she has not yet decided on, though she has begun quietly wondering whether a shop job, away from the noise and the lint, might someday be within reach, a thought she has not yet said aloud to anyone, not even her mother. Sunday, when it comes, is different in a way that the other 6 days of the week are not. The mill gates stay closed. Bridget attends Mass at the parish her family has belonged to since before she was born, a church built largely with contributions from Irish mill families like her own, brick and modest compared to the older Protestant churches in the city's original section, but full every week regardless. Afterward, she visits her parents' home, a small rented house shared with another family, where her mother serves a meal that takes longer to eat than anything during the working week allows, and where the conversation moves, as it often does on Sundays, toward news from relatives still in Ireland, arriving slowly by letter, always weeks old by the time it reaches this side of the ocean. Her father worked in the mills himself for years before an injury to his hand moved him into yard work instead. Less pay, but steadier hours, and he listens more than he talks most Sundays, though tonight he mentions, almost in passing, that he has heard the corporation is considering another wage reduction for the coming season. A rumor that moves through mill towns like this one with some regularity, sometimes true, sometimes not, but always taken seriously by families whose entire income depends on a piece rate that management alone controls. Bridget walks back to the boarding house before dark, since Mrs. Doyle's curfew applies on Sundays the same as any other night, and the last hour of daylight finds her sitting on the boarding house's narrow front step with her cousin, both of them quiet, watching the street settle for the evening, the same street that in 12 hours will be full again, with hundreds of people walking the same direction at the same hour, toward the same iron gate, answering the same bell. What strikes you most, sitting there with Bridget on that step as the light fades, is not any single dramatic event of the day. Nothing especially unusual happened. No accident, no confrontation with the overseer that amounted to anything. No news from Ireland worth repeating twice. It was, by Bridget's own likely account, an entirely ordinary week, indistinguishable in its shape from the one before it, or the one that will follow, and that historians studying this period have come to understand is closer to the actual texture of most people's lives in an American mill town in the 1880s than any single dramatic incident could show you. The mill towns of New England are often remembered through their most visible moments: a strike here, a fire there, a famous piece of labor legislation passed in response to some documented tragedy. Those moments matter, and they are worth knowing. But the daily reality for someone like Bridget was built almost entirely out of repetition. The same bell, the same 4 looms, the same walk past the same boarding houses, the same careful counting of piece rate earnings against the rent and board payment that never seemed to leave quite as much left over as she had hoped. There is something worth sitting with in that repetition itself, in the plain fact that an entire industry, an entire city, an entire way of measuring a life ran on the strength of thousands of individual days that looked almost exactly like this one. Bridget did not think of herself as living through history. She thought about whether her cousin's hands would steady with practice, whether the wage cut her father mentioned would actually come to pass, whether the money she was quietly setting aside might one day be enough for something better than the weaving room. Ordinary concerns, carried day after day by a young woman whose name, in the strictest sense, we do not actually know, though the pattern of her life is written clearly enough in the records left behind by thousands of women very much like her. Thank you for spending this quiet hour here with me tonight. If a story like this one is the kind of thing that helps you drift off, I hope it did its job. If you'd like, let me know in the comments what era or place you'd like to visit next time. I read all of them, and more than a few of these videos started as exactly that kind of suggestion. Sleep well, friend. I'll be here again next time.